Hello students, welcome to Unit 7. This is going to be chapters 5 and 6, Sensations and Perceptions. This is a really fun unit. We're going to be talking about how we process the world around us through all of our senses, such as vision and sight, and how we turned the world around us into neurological code and then create perceptions and opinions about the world around us. So that's going to be the main focus for this unit. Again, Unit 7, Sensations and Perceptions. This is about 6 to 8% of the exam, so this is a pretty big chunk. So to kick off Unit 7, we are going to begin with 7.1, Basic Principles to Sensing the World Around Us. Alright, so the two basic principles, as the name of this unit implies, is sensations. Sensations, as we've discussed earlier in the year with neuroscience and biology of behavior, is the process by which our sensory receptors and nervous system receive and represent stimulus energies from our environment. Alright, so for example, here we have some sensations, which are spicy potato chips, looks like. And so we can see the chips. They appear red. They're in a black bag, and they might appear grainy. We can hear the chips, like when we wrinkle the bag or we crunch the chips in our hands or in our mouth. We can hear them. The chips might have an oily, salty, grainy touch to them. And the chips might smell spicy, they might smell salty, and then, of course, they're going to taste spicy and salty. So these are all the different many ways in which we process the world around us through our senses, and the different ways our senses can be diversified. Such taste can be the mouth and the tongue, hands can be, or the sense of touch can be through the hands, feet, or just general skin areas. So that's what we'll be focusing on in the sensations portion of this unit. The second half of this unit is going to be focusing on perceptions. So whereas sensations is more concerned with how we process the world around us into our brain, perception is more going to focus on the process of organizing and interpreting those sensory stimuli informations and enabling us to recognize meaningful objects and events and form perceptions and opinions and about the stimuli that we process. All right. So what do you think? Are there 3 logs here or are there 4? Depends on your perception. Now, we all sense the same typically, but the perception is what explains the individual differences between people. All right, so like I said, we're going to be focusing more on sensation concepts to start off this unit. For the next 4 or 5 subunits, we're going to be on sensations. So starting now, we're on sensation. And to introduce this, we're going to start with how we process information. How do we process the world around us? It's through 2 methods of processing. The first is bottom-up processing. The second is top-down. With bottom-up processing, this is when you are adding up just our sensations to make a perception. Bottom-up processing is sensations, okay? It's how we take new information, new stimuli in our environment, and then form perceptions about them. So, for example, if you had never seen a locker before, for the first time you observe that locker, you're going to notice it has a color, it has a knob, it has little vents on the top and the bottom of it. It has hinges on the left-hand side so that it can open and all these different things. So you're going to add up all the many pieces of it and then create a holistic image in your head. That is bottom-up processing, and this is more common when you are seeing or experiencing something in the environment for the first time. Whereas top-down processing is when you typically have experience with something in your environment that you've already experienced before. So top-down processing is our expectations and experiences added together with sensations from our environment. So, for example, if you've seen a locker before, which you have because you've been in school now for a little while, if you walk down the hallway and you're texting on your phone and someone stops you and asks you what the locker looks like, you would be able to tell them without even actually looking at the locker. This is top-down processing, where the information is already in your head and it works its way down to your mouth to explain it. All right, so if that helps you remember bottom-up processing and top-down processing, hopefully that'll help you out there. Okay, so take a look at these graphs below, and that'll help you understand these further. These can be pretty complicated, so we'll talk about them more in class. All right. Another introductory concept is psychophysics. This is the study of relationships between the physical characteristics of stimuli, such as their intensity, and our psychological experiences of them. All right, so if it's really loud music and really heavy music, then our temporal lobe is going to be more intensely activated, as we can see in the image below. All right. Basic principles to sensing the world around us, and these principles apply to all of our five basic senses, such as hearing and seeing. So when we talk about the threshold, as we've talked about before with action potential and the firing of the neurons with neural communication, the threshold is kind of the same thing. Only in this instance, it applies to sensing sounds or sensing sights and colors. The threshold in this context refers to the dividing point between energy levels that do and do not have detectable effects. So you know how there are really, really high-pitched tones that you cannot hear? Well, those tones do not surpass your threshold for understanding or for even noticing it. All right, so that's what we mean by threshold. The absolute threshold is the minimum stimulation needed to detect a particular stimulus, at least 50% of the time. So if someone shines a light in your face and you detect it 50% of the time, it has surpassed your absolute threshold. If someone has a really high-pitched phone ringer, then you might not be able to hear it, but the person who owns the phone might be able to hear it. So it passes that person who owns the phone, it passes their absolute threshold, but it does not surpass yours. So for you, that stimulation is more subliminal, which we'll talk about here in a second. So here are some examples of absolute threshold. With vision, you can only see a candle flame 30 miles away. If it's 31 miles away, you can't see it. So it would be beyond our absolute threshold. If you watch for hearing, you can watch a ticking 20 feet away. You can hear a watch ticking 20 feet away. But if it's 21 feet away, you won't hear it more than 50% of the time, which means it's under your absolute threshold. So pause the video and look at smell, taste, and touch for the other minimums of absolute threshold, which means just above 50% of the time. All right. Signal detection theory is the theory that predicts how and when we detect the presence of a faint stimulus or signal amongst background stimulation. All right, so it's our ability to hear people in a room of people. We can hear one person amongst all of the background noise. So it assumes there is no single absolute threshold, and that detection depends partly on a person's experience, expectation, motivation, and level of fatigue. So, for example, my absolute threshold could be heightened because I'm awake, I just drank coffee, and so I'm going to be able to really process the world around me, as opposed to whether I'm tired, I'm groggy, and so I'm not able to really focus on what's going on around me. That's what the signal detection theory is pertaining to. So another example is in stressful situations, this may result in more false alarms and false memories. So here's an example of signal detection theory. Ask me in class and we'll talk about it more in detail there. So earlier we mentioned subliminal. Subliminal is stimulation or sensory stimulation that is below one's absolute threshold for conscious awareness. That means we detect the stimulus less than 50% of the time. So findings of subliminal research is, yes, we can process information without being aware of it, as we've already discussed from Nature Nurture. That's how we don't roll off the bed, or that's how we know not to veer into the left lane because we know there's a car over there even though we're not looking. However, the information does not have a dramatic, life-changing effect on our behavior. Subliminal stimulation is more common in like advertising. You might see like a computer with a Mac, the Apple logo on it. You might notice it and think, okay, you might not think anything of it, but you might think, oh, this character is using a Mac, I might need to use a Mac. So that would be an example of subliminal stimulation. So here's an example of that. That's not the forefront of your focus when you're watching this TV show, but you might subconsciously notice that, hey, there's a Mac logo here, and this guy looks like a serious professional, and I want to be a professional lawyer too, so I might go out and buy a Mac. So that's what it means by subliminal. You don't notice it 50% of the time, but it's kind of there, it's lingering. All right, so some other thresholds. We have difference. So we talked about absolute threshold and whether or not we sense a stimulus in our environment. So if it's above 50% of the time, if it surpasses our absolute threshold, then we will sense it, we will experience it. If it's more subliminal, if we experience it less than 50%, then we probably won't experience whatever the sensory stimulation is, whether it's a sound, a sight, whatever. Now, how do we tell the difference between one stimulation and another? How do we tell the difference between a small pebble and a large rock, for example? Tell the difference in their weight. Well, we use what's called the difference threshold. This is the minimum difference that a person can detect between two stimuli. It's also known as the just noticeable difference, or JND. All right, so how do you tell, look down here, how do you tell the difference between a really bright light and a really dim light? Well, we have the difference threshold. Another theory that applies to the difference threshold is Weber's law. And this is the principle that to perceive differences between two stimuli, those two stimuli must differ by a constant minimum percentage. The proportion varies by stimuli. So if one rock weighs 1 pound and the other larger rock weighs 5 pounds, in order to detect the difference in weight, if I increase the larger rock from 5 to 10, I must increase the smaller rock from 1 to 2. It must have that proportionate constant difference for us to tell the difference in weight. All right. So Weber's law. The reason we have Weber's law is so that we can notice the difference between things. So the difference between two light sources must vary in intensity by 8%. Two differences in weights between two objects must differ by 2%. Tones that are produced by two different sources must differ by a frequency of 0.3% in order for us to consistently tell the difference between the two. And that is the principle of Weber's law as it applies to difference thresholds, all right, processing different stimuli. All right, then there's also sensory adaptation, and this is another general concept as it applies to the study of sensations. And sensory adaptation is diminished sensitivity as a consequence of constant stimulation. So you know how if you walk into a room that's really smelly, and then after a while it doesn't smell as bad anymore? The reason that is because your nose and your olfactory bulbs adapt to that smell, and they get used to it, and your mind kind of puts it out of the forefront of your conscious awareness so that you don't really think about it anymore. Well, why is this? It's really a survival mechanism. If we're constantly stimulated by a smell or a tone, then we will gradually tune it out. We will ignore it subconsciously so that we can focus on more novel stimuli, maybe to stay alive or to look for sustenance, to look for food, or to just learn more about the environment around us, like we've talked about with babies and exploring their environment. So that's the principle of sensory adaptation. It's how we adapt to our environment through constant stimulation. We perceive the world not exactly as it is, but as it is useful for us to perceive it. All right, here's sensory adaptation, how our senses adapt over time. Why don't you pause and take a look? These guys right here are called, I think, polar bears. They actually go diving in frigid, ice-cold sea waters, and they actually get used to it over time. So these guys are weirdo. I would never do this. Okay, well, that concludes our first unit. I hope I didn't talk too frantically and quickly, so I'll see you guys in class. I'll have a good one.